I'll shut the door. That'll be their notice. Seems well, there's like 7 of them walking in, so I'll give them that notice for that time to get in here. All right. Good morning, all. All right. I'm going to pray, and then we'll get started here. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity today to learn and to learn a little bit about our own past and history. We pray you'd use it for our blessing and encouragement and to help us understand the roots of where we've come from and why, and may it be a profit to us as we seek to honor you in our lives and service you as a church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I am going to, just because of schedules upcoming and such, going to take this week to do a one-off teaching lesson and on American Presbyterian history in the beginnings. And I have other reasons for that. I would like to actually develop this into a further class at some point on the history of the American Presbyterian Church, but for the sake of today, we're just going to have a one sort of, how did the American Presbyterian Church begin? How did this come about that we exist? We have had a past lecture, really when we started on Westminster, on the founding of the Westminster Confession of Faith and how in the larger and shorter catechisms. And that is the root and the history of where we come from. And out of that, but yet we have a long history of Presbyterian work and such in America. The Presbyterians have had a significant role in American civil life. Now, there were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, and 11 of those men were Presbyterians. That's not a small number. One of those was a minister. Who was that minister? Does anybody remember? Witherspoon? That's right, John Witherspoon. There were 55 men who signed at the Constitutional Convention. 6 of those were Presbyterians. And you say, well, that's not a lot. It's not, of course, but if you think about the similarities to American government and Presbyterian government, it's not a one-to-one correlation by any stretch. But in terms of its founding, if you have 6 out of 55 and these type of people, 11 out of 56 signing the Declaration of Independence, you can tell that there had to be a level of influence there in American Presbyterians to help shape the government, how they might think about it. There have been 46 presidents. How many of those have been Presbyterian? Anybody want to guess a number?
Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, but we don't claim
You got to claim them. No.
You gotta own it, baby.
No. Yeah.
If I'm gonna own Witherspoon, I'm gonna own
Eisenhower was.
That's right. That's one. Anybody have a number?
7.
8. Close. 8.
Twice as long.
Yeah. So who are they? Anybody want to guess who they are? 8 men have been in American history of Presbyterian. We had Eisenhower, Wilson.
Roosevelt. Ted.
No. Making sure I didn't leave well. That's 2. Andrew Jackson is Presbyterian. James K. Polk is Presbyterian. My ancestor, so,
Mine too. James Knox Polk.
Yeah, we're cousins then. Who knew? We're cousins. Buchanan, Presbyterian. Grover Cleveland. In fact, he was raised by a Presbyterian minister. Grover Cleveland was. Harrison and Wilson. And one more, and he was the most recent. No, excuse me. He's the most recent one. Who's the most recent one to be Presbyterian? Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
Yeah, PCUSA, but you know, we're going to count it. Who had the most? So we're going to do American history for a second. Who came in first with most? What religious group has the most presidents in U.S. history? Episcopalians, Anglicans had 11. Now, we can win this if we want to fudge the numbers or stretch the numbers. Let me explain how. You have 11 Episcopalians or Anglicans. Now, I know this is where the thing people are going to say, well, Washington, Madison, Monroe ultimately ended up deist. That being the case, they were members of the Episcopalian Church. So we're going to do that. Second were Presbyterians. Fourth, or third, I should say, would be Baptists with 4. Unitarians had 4. Now this is where it gets a little interesting. The uncertains are 3. And here's why we can fudge the numbers a little bit if we really want to. Rutherford Hayes, no one's exactly sure what he was, although he had Methodist and Presbyterian background at some point. So if we count him, we're at 9. Barack Obama, no one knows what Barack Obama really was. He was UCC, but he disavowed that at some point, and nobody's really sure. So there's an uncertain there. And of course, the most uncertain of uncertain, Donald Trump, because he was raised PCUSA for most of his life, but is now claiming to be a non-denominational evangelical. So if we count Rutherford Hayes and Donald Trump, it's a tie. And if you really want to stretch this out, the Reformed or Dutch Calvinists have 3, so technically the Reformed we win 14 to 11 or 12 to 11 over the Anglicans. Calvin Coolidge, Van Buren, and Teddy Roosevelt Reformed Dutch Calvinists. Methodists have 3. The Quakers had 2. Restorationists, Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon. Restorationists, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ have 2. Roman Catholics, 2. Non-specified, 2. Lincoln, who was raised Calvinistic Baptist, so I'll let you decide if that's Reformed or not. And Andrew Johnson, nobody's really sure. And then the original nun. Who's the original nun?
N-U-N? What do you say?
N-O-N-E. Who was the original nun?
Oh.
It's kind of a big one.
Oh, Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. Raised Anglican, later rejected. So he would be the only open heretic of all the presidents in that sense. So, in other words, you have a lot of American Presbyterians involved in U.S. history, and it's not an uncommon thing for it to be there. But this is not, of course, this is not an American history class lecture. It's a Presbyterian history class. What do we want to understand about that? Well, we've talked about the Puritans and their place and role in coming over here, and some automatically think Puritan equals Presbyterian, and while we might want that to be the case, that's not exactly the case. The Puritans came to America from England and fleeing often persecution under the nonconformity law. Puritan does not mean Presbyterian, essentially also because of their English ties, because the Puritans were so often, at least in their initial desire, was to purify the Church of England, not to make it, not to be an independent church, as we would say. And Puritans had Presbyterian and congregational beliefs. Some were even still committed Anglicans. Of course, the great Bishop J.C. Ryle, some would say that's not Puritan time, but yet he's considered in that, and he was an Anglican bishop, hence the name Bishop Ryle. But they were both. Puritans were congregational, especially the ones that came to America, were Presbyterian and congregational in background. If you go to Massachusetts, Connecticut, other parts of New England, some of them even had official ties to the Church of England still under the king. The Presbyterians in the U.S. colonies came primarily from Scotland and Ireland, or Northern Ireland. And this is kind of what is interesting here. What you need to know about American Presbyterian history It's that it's unique and really, while all denominations and streams and such are unique, they wouldn't be if they didn't form. But American Presbyterianism and Presbyterian history is truly unique because it was formed without the oversight of an old world church. That's the thing to remember, is that usually churches would send missionaries. Missionaries oversee the work and establish a satellite church or presbytery, and it would be under the control of the original church. It was ascending to keep that going. That's not the pattern of American Presbyterian history, and that is unusual because it rose organically and independently. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there is nothing in common with other streams of Presbyterian history that are in America. It's just to say that the American Presbyterian Church is not a church plant from Scotland or Ireland. That's the thing to know. So that makes it unique. So the Scotch church, the Irish, they did not come here as a branch from that. We're going to talk a little bit about that and plant a church. It's not a church plant in that sense. Thus, it has, American Presbyterian grew up with individual characteristics that are different from Presbyterians in other countries. Are there any questions about that?
So like if you're saying, if we compare it like what happened in Seoul, Korea, where American Presbyterians sent missionaries to Korea to continue,
Yeah.
like what we're doing in South America. and
Can be,
around the
yeah.
world. Okay.
In other words, the best way for me to say it is the RPCNA, the ARP, Presbyterian denominations, that's not the history we're talking about. We're going to touch on it just very briefly. And if you ever want to do this extensively, we could. We're talking about that denomination that ultimately the PCA and the OPC come from. That is uniquely American. Does that clarify that a little bit better? That's a uniquely American church that is not in the way the others are connected. Now, oh yeah,
But did those who founded it, like McNamee and others, I mean, they came from that background, right?
they did, but
Okay.
they were not missionaries per
right.
se of that
Right.
background, which is kind of how we'll get there. So because they were here, that's a good
Yeah.
point. The Reformed Presbyterians, the Covenanters, were here and had been here a long time. They came out of the Reformed Presbytery of Scotland, and they are different in that they wanted to have a covenant with their theology. Again, I want to just sort of touch on this. If you want to get into this, that's going to take a long time. But we can. It's not, if the people demand it, I'm here for the people. The people. If the people want it, we will have it. They came about in protest because of wanting a certain form of government in the state and in the church and a national covenant in ways that you would see reflected, that there would be a Church of Scotland. It would be under the rule of Christ, yes, in different spheres, but nonetheless, it would be submissive to that. And they wanted to keep that covenant, the National League, the National Solemn League and Covenant, and what's the National Covenant? They wanted to keep that. And there's a long history there about how that didn't happen, and yet when they came here, they wanted to do that. In fact, they sought to set up colonies that were extensions and of that back to that church. So that's the Covenanters, and they've been here a long time. You also have the Associate Reformed Presbyterians, which are called the Succeeders. So there eventually was a reunion of sorts and getting things back together in the Scottish Church, and the Covenanters didn't like it, but the ARP, the Associate Reformed Presbyterians, they did, but eventually that didn't work, and they succeeded from that. Thus, they're called the Succeeders. They're transplants of the Scottish Church. These are two different groups that have a lot in common, but where they don't agree, they don't agree. Okay? So you have them here, and they're doing things, and yet they are not the ones and not the planting of the American Presbyterian Church, as we're going to ultimately see. So there is a distinction. So there's a history as why denominations are what they are, and these are no different. What happened early on is a distinctly American Presbyterian church. Any comments or questions you want me to try to fill in And I'm not promising to, it depends if it goes too far down the history trail. But any questions? Are we clear? Does this kind of fit what where we're going here? Yes, sir.
Just make sure, RPC and ARP were extensions of Church in Scotland,
They wanted to keep that.
and okay.
They wanted that to stay intact. In fact, when they were formed, they formed around the National Covenant and the Solemn Leaving Covenant, the ones in America, that is. And the ARP wanted to ultimately have that here. In fact, the reason they call it a synod and not a General Assembly is because they're waiting on things still to resolve with an establishment of Christ as king over the nation. So they don't call it a General Assembly in the way we do because it's not the case. So they're a synod. And they've been waiting a long time. And they're going to keep waiting. I didn't take a stance, I'm just telling you. They're going to keep waiting. You live in America, right? That ain't happening anytime soon. So that's just the way it is. But they came over here and they would come. I think it was Daryl Hart said that what was it that forced the growth of these different things, different branches, but particularly the American Presbyterian growth? You could say it was preaching, it was this or that. And honestly, it was just immigration and people coming over as much as anything. They would come over and they'd want to join churches. And so you would have some that would mix and match. So you'd have some that were Irish or Scottish in background that may not join in or have the ability to go to, let's say, an RP church or an ARP church. So they joined in the American Presbyterian work. And so people were coming over and settling into the New World. Some were Presbyterians, some aren't. Some of them were establishing churches that were Presbyterian in conviction, yet may have taken a different confession of faith and weren't trying to explicitly plant Presbyterian churches. I know you're thinking, say that again? They were Presbyterian, but they weren't trying to plant Presbyterian congregations. So you needed to have a church, you needed not just Presbyterian people, but people intent on planting Presbyterian congregations, not just Presbyterian sympathetic and we'll see what happens. That's not a knock on them. I'm just saying that's what they were doing. That's just the way it was. The English Puritans were a lot of that. And they had different thoughts and things. And that's where you have the Congregationalists and the more of the independent Presbyterian, if you will, minded way. They were Presbyterians, but they were not set on founding Presbyterian congregations. And that's the English side. So that's the question now, right, is where did Presbyterianism begin in America? And that's not an easy question in the simplest route, meaning you can't just say, what's the first congregation? Because some do that. And that was in the 1640s. They planted this congregation. They were committed Presbyterians. Tell me what the problem with that is, to say that fill in the blank congregation in, say, the 1660s, which, by the way, it's what I'm going to do is after that time. But just pick a time, and they were just a Presbyterian, maybe even believed the Westminster Confession. Why was that not the beginning of Presbyterianism in this unique way in America? It's actually a theological reason.
Just one church, not a Presbyterian,
Right.
so to speak?
Yes,
Would that have-
because to be Presbyterian has a definition to it and a theological conviction. Right? It depends on a conviction of government to be Presbyterian. It depends on a plurality of elders, right? Meaning more than one. It depends on parity. Not just one, one person gets one vote in that plurality. And it takes connection. To be Presbyterian is more than just to establish a congregation. It takes more than just having a minister. Presbyterianism, as we understand it, cannot exist with just one church or one pastor, because while it could be a constituted church and a true church, it is congregational in its government without the wider thing we're talking about. So therefore, we can't say those congregations were Presbyterian, or that's when the founding of the Presbyterian Church happened, because of these reasons and also their certain convictions. So with that, though, when was this the beginning? Well, we can say that the first American Presbyterian church, American Presbyterianism, was established here in 1706. when the Presbytery of Philadelphia was formed in 1706. That presbytery still exists today in the OPC, by the way. They still have that. Well, how did that come about? All right, isn't that the question? How much time I have? I'm doing pretty good. Well, the name was said earlier. Who is called the father of American Presbyterianism? Anybody know that? His first name is Francis. His last name is McAmey. Francis McAmey. Yeah, Francis McAmey. He's considered the father of Presbyterianism, of American Presbyterianism. He was born in Ireland, so he's Irish. Who's Irish, by the way? Anybody in here know Irish that they're aware of? Okay, nobody wants to admit it. Okay. So born in Ireland, 1658. We're not exactly sure why he left, but they left at some point. And he was ordained. I'm not sure why he left, but at some point he had been ordained and became a minister in Ireland, but he ends up here in 1683, and he is seeking to plant a church to do evangelism to migrants around the Chesapeake Bay. That's where he wants to work. And he organized the first church in Maryland in 1684. Now think about that. The first church was organized in 1684, and this is a church it's intentionally going to be a Presbyterian church and connected to a presbytery. And that was in 1684, which is 22 years before the first presbytery. That's a long time. Most of the time, McAmey did itinerant evangelism, and he tried to get churches in London and other parts of the old world to send ministers. They needed help. They didn't have a lot of money to do this. And so, ultimately, that's when the first church was there, and the first presbytery is organized in 1706 with 7 ministers and 3 churches. And they basically did what ministers, presbyteries do. And they even ordained, they're the first Presbyterian minister ordained in America, and his name was John Boyd. By 1716, it had grown to 17 ministers and churches. The records on this are a little hard to discern. That's not because I'm what do you laugh?
Just the way we keep minutes sometimes. I do.
Yeah.
My greatest sympathies.
Yeah. Well, in this case, some of them are gone. Like, they're just gone. Like, nobody has them. So when it says 17 ministers and churches formed 3 presbyteries, I don't know if that means, 1 minister equals 1 congregation. That's not, I couldn't quite tell. Maybe I just misread something. But nonetheless, 17 ministers and churches in 1716, they formed 3 presbyteries, which formed a synod. And so you begin to see now things organizing in a way. Any comments or questions on any of that up to this point?
I find that really interesting because being raised for some time in the Christian church, they tout that the Christian Church Disciples of Christ was the first Protestant church to be established solely in America.
Yeah.
So apparently that ain't necessarily so.
In fairness to them and to everybody, everybody's making that claim.
Oh, really?
They're all making one claim. And some of them are making the argument sort of like I did on the technically Presbyterians have more. There's a lot of that goes on, as well. But they say that, but yeah, there's a lot that would say, no, that was us. Or that was our cousin, maybe, a better way. Well, this is something to know that's important. Well, are there any other questions? I don't want to skip. Okay. This is something important to know about this, is that while this was a presbytery, and the presbytery was formed, it wasn't organized in the way that we might think of today. One author said something that, like, these guys that were doing this were not exactly you think of the founders of Presbyterianism. He's like, they're more like the most relatable, regular, everyday person because they didn't keep great records. They didn't, their sermons weren't spread widely of their great abilities. They were just doing their thing, committed and convicted they should do this. It's like they were very regular people, which is good because it's like, hey, great, I'm a regular person. That makes me feel good. And then it's back, it's like, yeah, these guys weren't great at a lot of things. One of which was organizing things the way it probably should have been done from the beginning. I relate to that very well. We're going to do this, and we'll figure out some of the details later. It was important, though, to know that, because even though they organized in 1706, they didn't formally adopt the Westminster Confession as the stated confession of faith at 1706. They just organized and were there. Now, they believed this. It's obvious they did, especially if you look at what we're going to get to next. But that was not done in 1706. The RPCNA and the ARP did, but that's because they came in connected to the old world, the old church, and thus they were already there. And as time went and issues came, they realized we've got to organize ourselves and do a better job. Well, they didn't actually complete this until 1729. The Adopting Act of 1729 is when some of this process became more formal and some of this organization. So 1706 to 1729. What are some things that came up there? They had regular stuff that comes up in church, disputes of ministers. They were ordaining people, credentialing. How was someone going to be trained? Disputes within the church, if that couldn't be handled, the presbytery. All the type of stuff that goes on. It was fairly normal in that sense. But there were other reasons that it took a long time to get this together, because you began to have different views and different thoughts on things, and in some ways they could be broken down really in detail, but there's more or less two sides with certain variations of a conflict there. And the conflict was regarding, we've approved the Westminster Confession as a statement of faith. How much are we going to adhere to it? And there was sort of, like I said, different versions, but you kind of had two sides of this. You had the Irish, so I'll see if you can figure this out. You've got, broadly speaking, the Irish and Scots on one side, and the more American and English. Let's pause for a second to say American and English. You have to remember that by 1729, people have been in this country a while. You would have had people born and raised or come over very early, that America is all they really knew. So this is not imagining the Irish and the Scots on one side and the English on another, bringing their past in. You have some uniquely American people there because this is where they were raised, or they had moved there and had been there long enough, right? But you've got the Irish Scots on one side and the American English on the other, broadly speaking. And there were two camps, again, broadly speaking, that in views of the confession. One wanted a full subscription that this is our confession and the ministers are expected to adhere to it and believe it. And they needed to believe it and not allowed to diverge in any way. And then you had another side that wanted a more looser subscription to the confession, saying essentially that, no, we don't want to just believe whatever we want, but there should be some allowance of room for different things, and even some to the degree that weren't even really comfortable with adopting the confession because they didn't like it in certain, though they believed it, they weren't exactly sure. But they sort of ended up in this camp of looser. Now I'll let you guess between more rigid and more loose where the Irish Scots fell and where the American and English fell. Which one did the Irish and Scots fall on?
Strict conscription.
Oh yeah, they fell on the strict side. Yeah, they were strict side, absolutely. And shocker, the Americans and the English, right, wanted a little